Hello and welcome to my FlossTube channel. I'm Jean Farish and I'm so glad that we get to have this time together. I have two things in my mind just right off the top that I want to do before I forget about it. One is I want to let you know that I am feeling a whole lot better. I'm right on schedule in terms of healing from that minor but necessary surgery I had to have on my foot. Getting around a little bit slower than normal, and I still need to sit with my foot elevated as much as possible. So this episode's going to be sort of short and sweet, I think, so I can get back and in my little cozy stitching setup and get my foot elevated. Anyway, and sort of related to that, or just as important as that bit of news, I want to thank you all for your good wishes. I'm sure that in the great scheme of things that all those good thoughts have hit the mark and come home and helped me along on my road to recovery. So I do appreciate that. Second thing is I am trying to remember to ask you to subscribe. When you subscribe, it not only helps me know that I'm kind of on the right track. It's a little bit of validation, I guess, and helps me sort of keep track of my growth. But it also means, I think, that you get notification when a new episode is published. I think that's how it works. Anyway, so with those two very important things out of the way, let me move right on to a little bit of content. If you follow anyone on Instagram, then you may know that I have started, I guess, I don't even know what you call it. Is an Instagram account, whatever. I'm there, Jean Farish Needleworks. And what I started doing last week was posting photos of my progress on the Bighorn and Eagle sampler, stitching it in 30-minute increments. And I mentioned that, I think, last week that that's what I was going to do. So it's been kind of an interesting thing because normally I just stitch until something else needs to be done, or I don't know, all the various things that make us kind of define our stitching sessions. But for this project, I've been setting a timer for 30 minutes and just stitching for the 30 minutes. And so it's been kind of interesting to see, first of all, how much I get done in that short amount of time, and also just seeing the daily progress. Well, hasn't quite been every day, but almost every day progress of the photos that I've posted. So this is the sampler that's for the Redwoods Rails and Winery trip, and I am looking forward to it as I am all of the trips I have planned. I started, I set my timer for the 30 minutes and then realized I needed to do something else. And so I stopped and then I'll just resume it. But that's what this last little thing is. And so that's been kind of interesting. When the timer goes off, if I'm in the middle of doing a stitch, I just stop. And that's taken a lot of discipline. So this trip's going to be, I think, a little different than a lot of the trips. I guess every trip has its own flavor, but this one, the group is deliberately a bit smaller than what we normally have. And it's going to be, I think, a great opportunity to, well, really all the events are really good for making new friends and developing new skills, seeing new places, or revisiting places that you've been before. And I think that for those of you who have gone to stitching retreats, but maybe your favorite travel buddy is not a stitcher, what a trip like this Redwoods Rails and Winery tour does is gives you an opportunity to combine the two. Because frankly, what we're going to see and do on this trip is going to have wide appeal. In the evening, yes, well, there's 2 evenings that we have classes planned, and we do have the stitch along project that we'll do together. But even the casual stitching time, I see that as a time for us just to kind of gather in the hotel lobby or one of the seating areas or whatever and just chat and get to know each other. And so I think that that's going to make it really, really special. So anyway, there are still some spots left on that trip if you are interested. And I'll put the link to the trip details in the episode description. Back in episode number 42, I was doing a segment during which I was threading a needle with a needle threader. And I got just the most wonderful comment from Padma. And I hope I'm saying your name right. This is what she wrote. I watched you thread your needle with your little needle threader hook. You're pulling 4 strands of thread through the eye of the needle the way you do it. And that's why you struggle a little bit to get that hook with 4 threads through the eye. You could instead put the loop of your thread onto the hook. If you do that, you're only pulling 2 strands of thread through the eye, which pulls through more easily. And I'm like, oh my gosh, she is so right about this. And I love these kinds of comments because they illustrate one of the things I've been saying all along, and that is that all of us, professional and newbie, are learning new tips and new techniques all the time, and we learn them from each other. And I hope that that spirit of sharing just goes on like forever. But let me show you what she's talking about here. First, I'm going to demonstrate as close as I can what I actually did that day. And that is taking out 1 strand. Oh my goodness, I came down here without my sponge. Oh, that's unusual. Oh well. So I'm not going to dampen this. So in using the needle threader, well, first of all, let's just talk about the needle threader itself. I really recommend this type of needle threader. Let me come in a little bit closer here. It has 2 different hooks for different weights of thread. And for most of what we're doing, we're going to be using the smaller hook. And you put it through the eye of your needle. Now, in this case, is a number 26 needle I have here. And what I did that day was to catch the 2 strands on my hook. And then as I'm pulling it through, of course, I'm actually pulling 4 threads through. What Padma is saying is instead is let's flip this around, and when you're using the loop method, hook it on the loop. Whoops, I'm sorry, I'm off camera. I get so excited about what I'm doing. And then it just pulls through so much more easily. And then you can still pull it through to where the cut ends are close to the eye or needle. Now again, in a rare thing here, I've come downstairs without all my tools, and so I don't have my sponge, so you can see how curly the thread is rather than straight like it normally is. If I wasn't recovering from this foot thing, I'd run upstairs and get my sponge and come back down, but I'm not going to do that. So anyway, so I thank her for pointing this out to me, because it does make so much more sense, and it's a tip that I will use forever and think of her fondly every time I do. And kind of while we're on the subject of needles, I got this question from Liz. And then after replying to her, I probably saw the question 2 or 3 more times in the same day on various Facebook groups that I belong to. So it's something that I think we really do need to talk about here. This is what Liz wrote. Hi, Jean. I hope you don't mind me asking you a question here, but I am getting conflicting answers. I'm relatively new to cross stitch, and I want to try a pattern on 28 count even weave. What is the best size needle to use? A calculator I use said a 28, but Google says a 24. Thanks for any help you can give me. Now, it's not just fabric calculators and Googles and whatnot. You are going to get different information from different sources. And I want to say a couple things about that. One is there's no harm in experimenting. If one source says a 24 and another says a 28, and there is a needle size in between, which is a 26, why not try all 3? You can get packs of tapestry needles that have an assortment of sizes in them. And this, I think, empowers you to make some of your own decisions, because many of these things are not exact sciences. It's a matter of what works for you. But let me also share what I responded, how I responded to Liz, and I ended up posting this, like I said, a couple different times, all in the same day. I said, I'm not so much a stickler on assigning a certain needle size to a certain count fabric, but here is what I generally say. Always use a tapestry needle, not an embroidery needle, and choose the size based on the thread that you're using and the fabric that you're stitching on. Here are the 2 questions that you need to ask yourself every time. Does the needle pierce the fabric without making holes? It should not make the holes in the fabric noticeably larger. Can you comfortably thread the eye of the needle with the number of strands and the weight of the thread that you are using? And if the answer to both those questions is yes, you have found the right size needle. So I shy away from any sort of table or I don't know, source that says on this type fabric you always use this, because it all depends. What type of stitching you're doing, what kind of thread you're using, what kind of stitcher you are. And right now I'm not even going to get into some of the variables, like there are petite needles, and there are, believe it or not, needles with the eye in the middle that both ends are pointed. There are what people call self-threading needles that have a little break in the eye. So pushing all that aside for today and just talking about needle size. And I have spoken to this before, so those of you who have watched that other episode, forgive me for repeating this, but it seems like first of all, it's a great question, and it's an element of our craft that can make your stitching more or less comfortable and more or less successful in terms of just creating pretty stitches. So it's a great question, and one I think that everybody really needs to know the answer to. It's a basic. Sort of like, again, if you're cooking, to know that self-rising flour and all-purpose flour are not the same. It's just a basic that you just need to know to be a successful baker. Anyway, so what we have here, what I pulled out of my stash are 4 of the most common sized needles that we use for cross stitch. And whoops, I got caught on the edge of the felt. Okay, so first of all, the larger the number assigned to the needle, the finer it is. So what we have here is a 22, a 24, a 26, and a 28. And when you see them like this, it's easy to see that between the 28 and the 26, there's not a huge amount of difference. But when you put that 28 next to a 22, I mean, it's a remarkable difference. So when you are doing cross stitch, again, choose a needle that as you're stitching, it's not distorting the holes. If you put your needle through the fabric, an unthreaded needle through your fabric, and you can't tell where that needle went, then that's a good indicator. If you can thread the needle comfortably, then that's a good size needle. So back to Liz's question, she had one source that said that she should use a 24, which is this one, and another one that said she should use a 28. So you can see that there really is a big difference between the two. Another question that came up, it seemed like several times, either that or I just happened to notice it more this past week, and that is a question of what is it that we cross-stitchers mean by the term count? And it can mean several different things. For example, if you're talking about a linen or an even weave, count is the number of threads per inch. So Probably the most common are 28 threads to the inch or 30 threads to the inch, but you'll also hear mention of threads counts that are in the 40s and 50s. And coarser fabrics as well. One of my favorite designs I stitched on a fabric that's 18 threads to the inch. So that's one thing, is if you're talking about a linen or an even weave, count refers to the number of threads per inch. If you're talking about Aida, it's talking about the number of squares per inch. And again, the most common sizes are probably 14. There's also Aidas that are coarser, like 11. There are Aidas that are finer, 16, 18. And so when we're talking about Aida, we're talking about the number of squares per inch. The count can also refer to the number of stitches per inch. If we're talking about stitching on Aida, the count and the number of stitches per inch are pretty much the same. I'm not saying that you can't stitch in a different way on Aida, but the traditional use of that fabric is that you have one stitch in each square, which is one of the reasons that many people gravitate toward it. It makes it an easy transition for a beginner, because a square on the chart looks just like a square on the Aida, and it makes it very easy to replicate that. So for Aida, the Aida count and the number of stitches per inch are essentially the same. When you're talking about linen or even weave, in most cases, actually, I don't want to quantify that. I will say that as much as 20 years ago, most stitching done on linen and even weaves was done what we call over 2, so that 1x is 2 threads wide and 2 threads high on linen. There's a contemporary movement that grows, it seems, by leaps and bounds, where many people are stitching what we refer to as over 1, so that each intersection of that linen or even weave has a stitch in it. So just to use a really simple illustration, if we're talking about 28 count linen or a 28 count even weave, if you're stitching over 2, then you end up with 14 stitches per inch. If you're stitching over 1, you would have 28 stitches per inch. So there's a huge difference in terms of the number of stitches that you would have in any inch going across or down. Before I leave this subject, let me tell you 2 things count does not mean. It does not mean the number of holes per inch, and it does not mean the number of threads or stitches per square inch. And I can see where that latter thing becomes an easy thing to misunderstand, because we talk about squares on our chart, we talk about squares on our Aida, so it's very easy in your head to say, okay, well, that's like square inches. It's not. They are 2 completely different things. I'm not going to sit here and do the math, but you can if you want to. If you are stitching on, say, 14 count fabric, in any 1 inch, you have 14 stitches across and 14 stitches down. So multiply 14 times 14, and you get the number of stitches per square inch. And you can see that that is a number that just doesn't matter to those of us who do cross stitch. It doesn't matter to the designer. It doesn't matter to the end user. So just erase that from your mind. It's not the number of stitches per square inch. It's the number of stitches per inch, either horizontally or vertically. And speaking of counting, one of the other things I see some confusion surrounding is the question of how many threads we're stitching with. And again, I completely understand the confusion. Part of it comes from the fact that we don't have one single source to refer to for getting answers to these types of questions. And that confusion, I'm being confusing right now, forgive me. What I see is a confusion about how many threads you're stitching with. so that if you take a single strand and you fold it in half to use the loop starting method, you started with a single strand of floss, but you are now stitching with 2 strands. What I would like for you to think of to answer your own question clearly and without any confusion is, think of the number of threads or strands that are through the eye of the needle. If you have a single strand in the eye of your needle, you're stitching with 1 strand. If you have 2, you're stitching with 2. It doesn't matter how many you started with and whether or not you folded it in half. Another great question I saw this week when I fell down that rabbit hole that we all know is Facebook. The question was about selvage, and I want to address that a little bit right now. First of all, let's talk about what selvage is. If you're familiar with the Zweigart brand of fabrics, then you recognize the orange stripe that's woven into the selvage. That's not true of all brands of cross-stitch fabric, but that is true of the Zweigart fabrics. So this very dense corridor right here, that is the selvage. And it's created in the weaving process when the threads are woven over and you make a U-turn and go back and forth and back and forth. And so on both the right and the left sides of this large piece of fabric, you're going to get the selvage woven in place. So that's what a selvage is. The question came up in a discussion about whether or not when you buy a piece of fabric, whoops, just drop that on the floor, whether or not the selvage is included in those measurements. Now, as far as I know, there's not an industry rule or regulation about this, but there is a kind of the common practice. And the common practice is that, yes, the selvage is included. If you buy a full yard of fabric, and let's say that that fabric is 54 inches wide, then it will be sold to you as being 54 inches by 36 inches. If that fabric is sold as a half yard, then depending on how it's cut, it's either going to be 54 inches wide and 18 inches down, or it's going to be half of the 54, which is 27, by 36. So it all depends on how it's cut. So yes, the selvage is included in that measurement. I think the implication in the question and the discussion that followed was whether or not that's fair and whether or not the consumer has been cheated out of some fabric. And I want to say that, in my opinion, the consumer is not harmed in any way, shape, or form by the selvage being included. There is a certain subset of consumers that like to get a piece of fabric that has the selvage, because then they are easily assured of what is the weft and the warp of the fabric. They can keep that selvage on the right or the left, and they know that their fabric is now oriented the same way it was when it was woven. And some needleworkers find that to be an advantage. I personally don't think that the way the fabric is oriented makes any difference in terms of counter cross stitch or the counted thread work that I have done so far. Perhaps there is an advantage to it, and I'm just not aware of it. So why is it not cheating if that selvage is included? Well, the main reason is that and I'm sure somewhere there's an exception, but generally speaking, we don't cross stitch or embroider on the full width of the fabric or the full length of the fabric. If you're using a Q-snap or an embroidery hoop, then obviously you need fabric that's encased in that apparatus. You can't stitch all the way to the cut edge of the fabric. You've got to have something that's in the hoop or in the Q-snap. But even if you're stitching in hand, as I do, you still do not traditionally stitch all the way to the edge of the fabric. You need fabric for wrapping around a piece of foam core for framing. You need fabric in a seam allowance if you're making a pillow. So no, don't feel that you have been cheated in any way, shape, or form if you buy a piece of fabric and the selvage is included in the measurement that's on the package. So I hope it kind of puts that question to rest. So that brings us to a close here. I have enjoyed my time with you as always, and I hope that wherever you are that you get to stitch happy and stay safe, and I'll see you next week. Thanks for watching.